Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. It's really a personal joy to me today to welcome Dr. Corey Widmer as our guest on Conversing. Corey is the lead pastor of Third Church in Richmond, Virginia. He has served as the study assistant to John Stott a number of years ago and has done both his MDiv and his PhD. When Corey and his wife, Sarah, first went to Richmond to help plant a church in the East End of Richmond, which is a largely Black and urban neighborhood, it was co-pastoring with a very close friend, and they did this work together for over 13 years. The congregation that sponsored that urban congregation was Third Church in Richmond, and he is now the pastor of that congregation. He's had a life in both dimensions of Richmond's profile, and he's doing work that is deep and consistent and solid, honest and courageous, and complicated. He understands the complexity, the pain, and the joy of being a pastor. Today we have an opportunity to explore that together, and I couldn't be happier. Corey Widmer, welcome to Conversing. What a gift to have you.
Thank you, Mark Labberton. It's such an honor to be here.
You know, you and I have known each other for a number of years, and part of the reason that we first came to know each other is that we had both served as study assistants to John Stott. You came much later. I was in the early bank, and I just know that the impact that he had on both of our lives is significant. And while that's not really what we're here to talk about, he both shaped us really in many, many ways, especially in our thinking about preaching, but pastoral leadership in general. So, you know, we're living in this really thorny time, super complicated, fraught with difficulties and challenges that pastors have already and then are only magnified and sort of distorted in a certain way by the season that we're in. And I just wonder if you could start by just describing to those who are pastors and those who aren't pastors, what is your take on this moment? And then I'm going to come back to John in just a minute. But what is your take on the time that we're in? Give us some descriptors.
Oh, goodness gracious. Fraught, volatile, combustible. What are other adjectives that I could pull out of my thesaurus? You know, in some ways, we all hear that every Christian, every human might say, gosh, I am living in the key moment of history. I am living at the epicenter of the most dramatic moments that history has faced. And so I don't want to be hubristic about that we somehow are living in a time that is utterly unique. I think that every Christian and every pastor, and we're really talking about what it means to pastor today, I think every pastor in every time has a very similar calling, which is to shepherd the people of God and to form a community under the supremacy of Jesus' lordship and to look to his word for direction and leadership and to shape our imaginations and action in the world. And so in that sense, our time is like every other time. But I do think that there are some particular things that make this particular time unique, especially in the history of United States and American democracy, that especially in the way that the Christian message continues to be used in ways that feel antithetical to the way of Jesus and to the traditional ethic of Jesus. That feels particularly distressing, and I think does create unusual pressures on the pastor and complicated questions for the pastor as she or he gets up in the pulpit week by week.
Yes. You know, I think one of the things that I often ask myself as a question, both physically and metaphysically is where am I?
Where am I? That's a good question.
And I think that's what you're getting at. There's this constant sense of some kind of instrument trying to measure where am I? What is happening? Where do I take my bearings? How do I find my voice? How do I speak in a way that's going to matter? How do I connect with people? How do I enter into where everyone is? Because I'm every bit is in the midst of it like anyone else is. I'm not in any way different from anyone else. And then I have a particular vocation that you and I share of being a pastor, which does, not by its role, but by its actual function, it means the question of where am I has to be calibrated, it seems to me, even more finely, because there's so much seen and unseen information about, quote, where we are.
Yeah.
So
which is, I think, one thing that also makes our calling. I think some people sometimes ask me, what's the difference between preaching and teaching, or the difference between being a pastor or a professor? And I do feel like that is one unique quality that makes our vocation distinct, is that question of where am I? You know, our mentor, John Stott, used to always say that we're bridge builders. You know, we take the ancient text and we build bridge to the modern world. I mean, it's a little bit of a modernistic way of understanding biblical interpretation, exegesis. And yet the truth of that is that we are always asking, what does it mean to have this word in this world at this particular moment? And we can't ever just be content with exegeting the text. We always have to ask, what does it mean? And how does it land? And what is the impact? And how does it form the people of God for the world that they're walking out into tomorrow morning? And so I do think that's one of the things that makes our calling unique.
As well as how is the text being allowed to exegete us?
Yes.
And I think all of those factors are so key. I want people to understand the particularity of your location. Richmond, Virginia, where you pastor, is not a neutral zone.
No.
that name, that city, that location, that history may not be freshly in people's minds. So just bring to the surface for everyone what defines the history and life of Richmond, Virginia, would you say, most importantly right now?
I mean, Richmond is an amazing city. Its history is so powerful and beautiful, and also deeply fraught with horrific oppression and human wickedness. You know, it was, you can find just a stone's throw from wherever you walk some of the things that have literally shaped our nation. Our first home was just down the street from where Patrick Henry delivered his "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" speech. And then just down the road from that church where he delivered that was one of the largest slave markets in the United States. It's just it's a place that's marked by both beauty and brokenness, that is grappling to understand its history and tell the truth about it, and also work to find healing in it. My wife, Sarah, and I have been here for over 20 years, and what led us here initially was actually the inspiration of John Perkins, who just died recently, and his call to Christians to relocate into places of urban blight and to work for reconciliation. And so that's what initially drew us here, is that we saw so many Christians that we admired who were at work in Richmond doing that work of healing. And I've now been a pastor here for more than 20 years, both at a large, mostly white suburban congregation and a small multiracial urban congregation, which has given me a really fascinating picture into the culture and the people of Richmond. And it also, I think, is a lovely thing, because even though I've been employed by the same church, Third Presbyterian, for over 20 years in two different congregations, I think of myself as not only being a pastor in a particular church, but also a pastor in a particular place. And that rootedness of geography and the rootedness of the people and the culture and the history here is really important to my sense of vocation. So that feels like a real blessing that not many pastors have. And that is, I think, is increasingly rare to be rooted in a place for a long time.
I don't think it's an exaggeration, but correct me if I'm wrong, that in many ways it was like being a pastor in two different worlds under one umbrella.
It really was.
Say a bit more detail so that people can understand these two spheres.
Yeah, I mean, Richmond is a deeply segregated city. The city center itself is majority Black and suffered all of the normal blights that happened around the civil rights movement and afterwards beforehand with Jim Crow and then afterwards with white flight and the decentering of the city itself as it moved westward as the suburbs were built. And so our church, Third, did that white flight thing in the 1950s. And so to our current location. So our current location is in the first ring of the white western suburbs. And we were living and ministering for about 13 years in the urban center, which was a complete opposite context. And so I think that Sarah and I very early on felt like we ourselves were bridges. We were bridging between the rich and the poor, between the white and the Black community, between those who were privileged and those who were not. And so that also has become, I think, a part of our vocation is bearing. One of my friends once said, well, of course you're stressed because bridges are stretched between 2 points and bear tremendous weight.
Yes.
And that's how often it's felt. And honestly, sometimes even recently in these fraught political times, pastoring a very purple congregation often still feels that way. It's the bearing of weight. And so I do think many pastors, whether it's because of different contexts, because of different people, because of different political parties within their communities, whatever, I think many pastors feel the weight of serving in that bridging kind of ministry.
Right. I think it's worth people hearing a little bit, Corey, about the battle that you went through when you were asked to move from the initial congregation that you had served for 13 years, and then to move into being the pastor of the suburban congregation that was really the congregation that was paying for both ministries.
Yes.
And so you were an insider to Third, but you were also not an insider because you were in the east part of Richmond.
I was hired in 2005 as a church planter or as an associate pastor at Third, but we were living in the East End in this urban context. And then just a few years in, Third commissioned me and a Black pastor to co-plant and co-pastor this new congregation that Third supported and funded, and was very, very generous in their incubation of that new congregation. So that's where I served as a co-pastor for all those years, but continued to be on session at Third and occasionally preach. But and then in 2015, the senior pastor who retired, and they reached out to me to explore becoming the senior pastor, and it was, at first I was just like, no way. I mean, it was right. we were living out our dream. We were living out all the things that we had always dreamt of, living in this intentional community that was really, really hard, but really working really productively to help cross boundaries and bridge segregated and divided communities and work among the poor. But I would say through the discernment of even the people in East End Fellowship and through my co-pastor and other elders, really felt like it was time for me to step into this different context. But I think the key is for the same purpose, the same purpose of helping lead the people of God, to equip them, enable them to fulfill this beautiful mission and vision that Jesus Christ has given his church, which is to bear the good news of his kingdom for the shalom of all people and for the common good of the city. And the suburban church has just as much of a role to play in that as the city church. But yes, the worlds could not be more different.
Well, I remember walking with you through some of that and feeling the tension, because one was so much the visible expression of the sweet spot that you had sought and pursued and wanted to be in. And at the same time, you could see that there was an understandable appeal on the part of Third for you to come over into the role of being the pastor of the congregation, and yet to not want to do so out of, in a way, any symbol of rejection or distance from the East End, and at the same time not wanting to be engulfed and swallowed by this larger institution and by a completely different subculture. So how you were going to be a genuine pastor holding on to the whole of that was really, I think, as I remember, one of the great challenges. How do you do it in the way that you've just described, which I think you actually have done? And yet I do remember feeling very sobered by the breadth of that challenge, really, and and what it would demand of you, all that it would call forth from you, that I didn't have any doubt was there to be called forth, but I knew that the process was going to be very challenging to be able to do that. I want to go into this a little further because as we reflect on what it means to be a pastor in this particular set of times, I feel like that experience allowed you in a different era that was not marked by the same political actors and the same kind of main stage dramas that are going on today. But there were plenty of,
of course,
realities.
We've been in this trajectory for a long time. Let's face it.
Yes, exactly. So just walk us through that a bit, and then I want to step back and begin thinking about what the challenges are of being a pastor right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was profoundly shaped by that experience. And I think that there are many things from that experience that I've been able to carry right into my role within the last 10 years in a very different context in this larger suburban congregation. I think one of the things is learning how to hold, like I was saying, hold tension and bridge healthy communities across significant difference. You know, at Easton Fellowship, it was between the Black and the white community. And we would often say, look, if you are happy with the way worship is 100% of the time, then something is wrong. We are all committed to be equally unhappy because no one culture here has ultimate supremacy. We're submitting to one another's preferences. So there might be a song you like that someone else hates and vice versa. And many of those same things have translated into a congregation like ours that, frankly, when I showed up, did experience a lot of division between older and younger generations, between contemporary worshipers and traditionalist worshipers. And then ultimately, over time, as our political fracturing and our society has opened up, those same polarizations have opened up within our own congregation. And so it's required, I think, tremendous leadership to be able to hold those tensions together and to be able to bridge the kind of political polarities that exist within churches like ours, where there's just not a uniformity of ideological vision. So many of those things, and the capacity for me as a leader, I think that every pastor these days is having to learn how to practice, I think, what a systems theorist would call emotional containment, to how to, instead of avoid conflict or make conflict bigger, to absorb conflict, to absorb the tension, and to have enough emotional maturity to be able to hold that within our own nervous systems and our own bodies, to be able to bring people across difference together, and to be able to help to shape unity around what we hold to be central to our community, Jesus Christ and his kingdom. And so I think all those things that I learned in that time have been super helpful in pastoring a very different kind of church.
And it also gave the congregation an opportunity to have in a certain way, an on-ramp to these still more bracing winds, so that they could see you could see them. You had, in a way, practice at standing and loving one another at close range, which is always much different than from a distance. And you've done that with honesty. I think there's so many things about your pastoral leadership that I've admired, but one of them is your honesty and your relentlessness in expressing honesty humbly, which is a combination that's essential, I would argue, and unfortunately not all that common. So the fact that you are as honest as you have been about your own convictions, your own persuasion, your own interpretation, the meaning of your faith, the significance and implications of the faith, yet you've held that with a genuine humility that allows you to be courageous on the one hand, to be teachable, and nevertheless to be bold. So that's, again,
well, I appreciate you saying that, Mark. I really do. I don't think that's true of me. I think I think I'm terrified of conflict. I'm insecure. I'm prone to anxiety and depression. I mean, yes. I don't think you've seen the true me, Mark.
I've seen that, which is only just.
I will say, I have learned those things. You know, we were talking earlier in the day before we started the recording about what happened in 2021 after the murder of George Floyd, and in Richmond, as you can imagine, being the capital Confederacy, having more Confederate monuments than any city in the country, our city exploded. And so that was not a moment where to be a faithful pastor in that moment was not to stick your fingers in your ears and just preach the text without any reference to what was going on around us. It had to speak. It had to address how does the kingdom of Jesus address what is happening in this moment in our own city. And so I attempted to do that faithfully, and I took some risks. And I was probably more bold than I had been before, especially about speaking about institutional racism and the way that the history of oppression in our city impacts the world that we live in today, and the world especially as white people that we inhabit. And I guess I just thought that if I just explained this well enough, that everyone would agree.
Yes. Be the calm, cool, collected, and rational person.
And I worked so hard. I was so clear.
I'll lay out the case.
I did video lecture. It was during COVID, so I did video lectures, and I did sermons, and I posted resource pages, and I just gave the most reasoned, biblical, gospel-centered, theological defense of racial justice. And anyway, but it was a terrible conflict. We had a terrible conflict in our church, and I felt profoundly misunderstood, and I felt like a failure because I thought that success meant handling difficult things without any conflict. And I realized out of that experience that that is an impossibility. You cannot be a pastor and avoid conflict. It is in fact a continuous element of pastoral ministry, much to my chagrin. And I realized that what I could best do in that moment is to actually continue to ask for help from the Lord to be faithful and true to my convictions while being deeply emotionally connected to my people, even when they may have thought I was the enemy. So that was a really hard time, but I think it was a time that taught me about the importance of this balance of both compassion and conviction, and being able to be courageous, yet also be deeply empathetic and emotionally connected to your people.
Yes. Well, I do think that all of that underlying anxiety and depression and fearfulness and so forth, those are familiar to you. They're certainly familiar to me. And I think that inherent challenge in being in the vortex of realizing that there is a strategy of pastoral ministry that's about domesticating these issues in such a way that you just really do avoid them, or you euphemize them in such a way that you pay almost no price, and therefore you make no headway actually in the church, but you may have, quote, kept the peace, but it's at a cost of not letting the gospel do its gritty, salty, light-bringing work. And I'm just pausing because I'm just so taken with what every Christian, really, whatever their setting, whatever their vocation and calling, if we're seeking to be people who are credible witnesses, we're all going to face those particular challenges. But I do think it's important for listeners, again, whether pastors or otherwise, to realize that the challenges that you're living vividly in front of a congregation as its pastor are really the challenges that every person sitting in the pew theoretically is being at least welcomed into joining, because it isn't just your work or the session's work. It's really the work of the people. And it is literally the liturgy of God's people in the world as light and salt. And the challenge of that, when we can see that we share it together, makes it really different. And I think my sense is that partly it seemed to be that was during the Eastern Fellowship years that your own language around community and communion and a we rather than a me, not egocentrically, that wasn't your issue, but I'm meaning more like it's really a collective us that has to do this work, not just individual work. So I guess I'm curious, when you think about the influences that have helped shape you to be that kind of pastor, on the ground there are some really outstanding lay leaders in your congregation.
Indeed.
And there are some staff people who were important conversation partners. And there were, other people beyond that in circles of fellowship and connection that you have. One of the things that we both know and have already referred to is this influence of John Stott. So to have been early shaped, just about each of us were, by this towering influence, it's clear from the beginning to both of us that our vocation was not to be John Stott, and it was not to even think in those terms.
We're both married, for one.
Yes, well, touche. Yes,
we're too soft, Mark. We're too soft.
Yes, exactly. But there were things that really formed you, as they did me. When you think about the storms that you've been through up to now, and how his example affected the way that you have been able to see yourself in this moment, what would be some of the things you would point to?
Oh my goodness, so many things. I mean, certainly he had an enormous impact on me, and I know you, in his understanding of the role of the preacher. That I grew up in a wonderful church, but a church where a pastor essentially got up and shared an inspirational story and read a verse and told a joke, and that was the sermon. And it was lovely, but when I first started sitting under Stott and his preaching, when I moved to London, it was a revelation. I'd never really heard anyone take the text so seriously and be able to draw such beauty and truth out of the text and apply it in such a transformative way, in such a passionate way, such a way that was so given through the fullness of his personality. And so I think that was the first thing, as I realized that is one of the true things that we bring that is so unique about our vocation, is that we're not getting up just to speak our opinions. We're not getting up to be entertainers. We're not getting up to give our hot take on whatever political issues going on, that we actually stand under the Word of God, and also very influenced by the Reformed theologian Karl Barth in this way, that the Word has a unique and powerful voice in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that is the supreme call that we're given, is to be vessels of that Word, and we stand under it, and we're judged by it. But I think that the additional thing that I think was so affecting of me from Stott is that he wasn't just a Bible teacher. Like, he brought that biblical vision to so many diverse topics and perspectives about things that humans grapple with and struggle with in the world. I don't know if all the listeners know this, but he was the principal writer of the Lausanne Covenant, and there was a serious debate at the Lausanne movement, at the Lausanne Conference, about whether the concerns of the global South, which were principally concerned about poverty and alleviation of poverty, and the concerns of the growing gulf between the West and the non-West, the rich and the poor, whether that should be included in the Lausanne Covenant as central to the mission of God and the mission of the church. And Stott departed from all of his Western peers to stand with his Southern brothers and sisters, and ultimately was able to persuade the rest of the conference to indeed incorporate justice, social concern, alleviation of poverty, concern for the poor into the central mission of the church. And, I just look back on that now, Mark, and I think, like, that was just so before his time. And, another thing, I think the reason that feels so relevant right now is that we're living in a time that is so binary. Most white evangelicals side with Republicans, or sort of the Republican Party, because it sort of is the party of personal morality. At least it was. It was. It's cared about things like abortion and sexual ethics and things like that. And then many African Americans, the Black church, main lines often sided with the Democratic Party because it stood for things like justice and social righteousness. And I think Stott just modeled, that you couldn't peg him. Stott would never fit in a two-party system, because you couldn't peg him, because he cared deeply about, things that you might consider to be traditional evangelical concerns. But he also just cared deeply about the environment and creation care and nuclear disarmament. And things that, would probably get him run out of the room in most conservative circles these days. And so he modeled to me that we do not take our cues from these political binaries. No political party in any way could possibly align with the values and the vision and the ethic of the radical upside-down kingdom of Jesus. It is an entirely different ethic. It's a different politic. It's a different kingdom. And I think he modeled that to me, and the way that he was sort of so unafraid to flesh that out.
Yeah, it is really, really remarkable. I do think that he also, as you've exemplified, really he also brought a fearlessness to this collision, believing that they were resolved in the being and character of God rather than in social political rhetoric or by the perfect argument. It was more like, no, these are the dual realities. These are very hard things to bring adequately together, and they must be held together because that's the nature of God's love and purposes, that they belong together rather than as opponents, let alone enemies. And I think his willingness, as you experienced and I did too, of independent pursuit of people with whom he had real conflicts, or they had conflicts with him, that he would pursue having reconciling conversations, or at least intended to be reconciling conversations where people, sometimes groups, sometimes individuals, where things needed to be talked all the way through could actually happen. And they didn't, of course, it didn't always work, and it didn't always result in some kind of reconciling understanding of one another. But it also showed, I think, you and I at an early stage, you and me, I should correct my English, which he would do if he was here.
Yes, he would correct your grammar.
Yes, you and me, Mark, not you and I. Okay, so you and me, and the influence of then realizing that these categories that I think sometimes we're not even quite convinced exist are actually space that as pastors we have permission and I think a vocation to step into. Yeah. And partly because of our role to help create something that literally might not exist otherwise. I think, for example, of the recent action you've taken along with many others in Richmond in drawing together a very wide cross-section of people to come together around immigration concerns and ICE-related concerns, and to make, a strong Richmond statement about the implications of all that was going on. We'll have the link in the show notes so that people can see what has emerged out of that. But that would be an example of asserting into a space that doesn't seem to exist, the possibility of a conversation that's desperately needed. That's a beautiful witness to the challenge. Corey, let's go back to the role of preaching, because certainly in John's case, one of his main gifts was really a call to preach and teach, and he did do it in the way that you're describing. So when you think now, it's an average Sunday, we're in Lent right now as we record this, we're coming toward Holy Week. We are allowing the meaning of Lent to now be seen as every generation and moment has to see that moment through the Lenten activities. What is preaching in this Lent like for you right now? What's happening for you?
Yeah. For me personally, this feels like a very Lenty Lent.
Touche.
Because there is so much to feel grief over, and so much to lament, and so many things that cause us to cry out to God for help and for mercy and direction. I think one of the things that I've been coming back to again and again is the journey that we follow Jesus on in Lent, this journey to the cross, this deep commitment he has to go the way of suffering, and the fact that no one around him, even especially those closest to him, understands what he is doing. The more he talks about his death, the more they talk about their own greatness, the more they talk about their own supremacy, the more he talks about downward mobility, the more they talk about upward mobility, and that ultimately he dies a slave's death, and that this way of cruciformity is the way of victory, is the way of triumph. Self-giving love, the cruciform way, is the way to life. And then he says to his followers, if anyone has come after me, take up their cross and follow. And so to me, that exposes in such a dramatic way, especially in this moment, I just believe that so many Christian people who are good-hearted and who I believe probably love the Lord, and I'm not judging any motives, but who I think out of our fear and out of our anxiety and out of our concern about what's happening in the culture are tending to turn to methods and methodologies and human leaders and political platforms and ideologies that counteract, contradict, undermine the cruciform way of Jesus, and that actually embrace a completely opposite way that embraces, power and dominance and control, alienation of the enemy rather than loving of the enemy, consolidating power for ourselves rather than giving power away. And so I do think that the journey of Jesus in Lent is so powerful because it doesn't just speak to our salvation, it speaks to the calling of every Christian, the calling of every community of Jesus to actually practice a different way of being in the world, a different way of seeking power, a different way of seeking greatness, a different way of finding our life and our security. So it does, to me, feel like the Lenten journey of Jesus feels particularly relevant in the context we're in.
Right. I just spent several weeks reflecting on Philippians 2, and it is the journey of downward mobility, downward identity, downward self-giving love. All of that is the primary way of Jesus in Philippians 2, that opening hymn, verses 1 through 11. And it was a very slow period of reflection for me. And I would take just a fragment of the phrase and spend several days just thinking about that one phrase. And it continues to be so true, as you've beautifully pointed out, that this process of internalizing the otherness to which we're called, as opposed to the instinct, which is to get Jesus to conform to what we already want to do, or however we prioritize our life, or whatever sociology we've been born into, or whatever political identity we may have taken up. And it's all about conforming Jesus to that, rather than, as you've said, the exact opposite. Like, how do I allow my life to actually be conformed to Jesus, not to be conformed to these other narratives and values? And I do think we're in a period, this is partly why, at least from my point of view, it feels right to say that the church in America is in an exilic period, because it feels like we should be on the outside of a culture that is ever more different and colliding with Jesus. Not because the church has ever been perfect or ever will be perfect this side of glory. I'm not trying to make that sort of idealized argument. I'm just saying we can orient the thing to which we're aiming, seeking, and we can also lose that orientation and yield to the other forces that are at play.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, I think that Jesus is so clear that, he says it so clear to his disciples. He embodies it himself, that there is no victory without cruciformity. There is no authority without kenosis, without self-emptying. And I think that I was really impacted by James Davison Hunter's recent book on the unraveling of democracy. And it's interesting because he talks about how there's just been this slide since the 1960s where there has been erosion of any sort of common social and moral center to our society. And as a result, these authoritarianisms have risen up, where rather than relying on persuasion or compromise or a democratic process, we've increasingly relied on power, whether it's power on the right or power on the left. And it's resulted in these distortions of our politics in which it's a zero-sum game. And it's if I give an inch, then I'm giving over to the enemy. And I just unfortunately feel like that there's so many Christians where we have just succumbed to that. And I think you're right. I think that the faithful way would be to step out of that system entirely and to say that we are actually going a different way. We are rejecting the way of dominance, because at the heart of the universe is not power. At the heart of the universe is communion, is love, is the triune God of love who invites us into communion with God's self, and that this is the meaning of life, is not power but love. And I think we would step out of it rather than get sucked into it and join those power play games. So it's a very serious time for the church, I think, to do some. I think we're living in an extraordinary moral and spiritual crisis that we will either look back and say the American church was an accomplice, or the American church was a prophet. And I'm not clear which it's going to be at this point.
Yeah, right. Corey, we both know that there is a classic paradigm that the church and pastors should imitate the kind of the three offices of Jesus as one who is a prophet and a priest and a king. I wonder if you could just unpack those three things and why it is that some reflection and application of those categories might be relevant to the moment that we're in.
Yeah, this has been a really helpful frame for me, of course, and it's very reformed. I appreciate you bringing that up. And of course, we're not Jesus Christ. We are not the embodiment of the threefold office of Jesus. And yet I think that the pastoral role is meant to reflect that threefold office. And I often think about that when I approach a sermon, when I approach the pulpit. I think when we think about the kingly dimension, we think about the way that the preacher points people to the reign of Christ, how this new way of Jesus is meant to be manifested in the world in material ways, in the way that we embody life in our neighborhoods, our families, our jobs, our vocations, our politics. I think that kingly way is most supremely described in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which he sees as the fulfillment of the Torah. And so I think that more than ever, we need to take the Sermon on the Mount like really, really seriously and like read it like every week and memorize it. And so I think that part of the preachers were calling people to live under the reign of Jesus. But then there's the priestly dimension, which I think really speaks to the compassion of Jesus. I think that people come, every pastor knows that every week you've got people in your pews who are wounded and anxious and weary and beaten up and terribly afraid and have marriages that are falling apart and kids that they don't know what to do with and fearful about the world. And I think that part of the pastor's role is to point people continuously to the compassionate presence of Jesus and the consolation that the gospel brings in their wounds. And then there's the prophetic dimension that we are called to help people see how the patterns of the world and the pressures that we're under often run completely counter to the way of Jesus. I think that's some of what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. I think it means sometimes we have to be very bold about naming the cultural distortions and the idolatries, whether it's power or fear or Christian nationalism or racism or consumerism or ideological certainty or all the things that we become captive to, or even wealth and defining what it means to be human apart from God. So I just think that as a pastor, I try to hold that frame, that trinity of roles together, because I think there have been times where I have mostly been priestly, which is fine. But I think when you're just focused on priestly, you can become overly therapeutic and everyone just comes to have their weekly therapy session. I think other preachers tend to be very kingly, where it's just all moral instruction and it becomes very like heavy and burdensome. And then I know preachers who are just pure prophet, and every week they're poor sheep come out licking their wounds after being denounced for 30 minutes. And so I just think that the pastoral and preaching task is to hold them in tension and obviously some texts are speak more to the others, but yeah, I'm always trying to keep those in mind. And I think that's important, especially in this time, because there are some times recently where I have been more prophetic, because I think that this time maybe does. I think pastors today do often need to exercise a renewed prophetic clarity than maybe we have had to in the past, because I think there are so many ways that we see the Christian message being distorted and embodied in ways that are antithetical to Jesus. And yet, people are still hurting. And we still have our people who are just like figuring out what to do with their teenage son who's, self-harming. I mean, those are our people, and we can't ever lose that part of our vocation. And I love that about pastoral ministry, is that it has to hold so many of these tensions together.
Well, I sometimes think of them as sort of three tent pegs, where the whole of pastoral ministry exists under the shelter of and provocation of Jesus's example in those three dimensions. And I do think we should claim the particular vocation that God may have given us, which may fall primarily in one of those three areas. But at the same time, I don't think it's ever to the exclusion of the other elements. And therefore, they may not be exactly equal, as though you just apportion, a third in each direction, but more that they are integrated together to me, when a person that is prophetic is also deeply compassionate, that's really transformative about how to receive their prophetic word, right? Than just sort of the condemning of culture or church or whatever it might be, which is not even a fair understanding of what being prophetic means, but that's often how it gets reduced.
Yeah,
So,
that's so good. And I think you're right, too, that depending on the pastor's personality, you will always tend to be more comfortable in one of those spaces. I just tend to be more a person that just drifts more into the priestly space probably because of my own wounds. I'm a person with, as one therapist once said to me, you have a complicated emotional life.
thank you for that blessing, therapist. Thank you, yes, for clarifying.
And so
that.
because of that, I tend to be very, I tend to, my heart goes out to people who struggle with the fragility of the human experience and the angst that it brings. And so it is a stretch for me to be prophetic. And so I've had to really push myself in these times to say that there are times when these things must be named. The lordship of Jesus requires it.
Right. But I do find it a beauty, actually, that you would say it that way, because I do think it's probably true that you may be more priestly than prophetic, let's say. But from where I sit and watch what God has given you as grace, I think, to be able to press into the more prophetic elements is striking enough that I would use it as one of the main descriptors of your preaching, and I think of your life, frankly. But I appreciate that you've said it in the context that you have. But I think it's a witness to how far God has taken you. That it's not just about settling into the thing that you find the most natural, but doing the thing that you genuinely believe, despite an inclination, perhaps it's different.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that. I really do. And that is God's grace, because it's not of me. But you know why you can know when you're really not a prophet is when, after you say the hard word, you leave the room and you say, oh, I hope that they don't feel too bad. I hope they still like me.
Touche, yes.
And that's when I have to do the hard work.
Totally. Yeah.
So yes, it's all grace.
Emotional complexity requires emotional regulation. So.
Yes.
Yeah, I hear you. Totally. Corey, when you think about pastors and the discouragement that many pastors feel these days, and the bewilderment, the sense of being under attack by their congregations, or by at least percentages within their congregations, or feeling pressed upon to take a certain political posture, I know that you've adopted many different forms of communication, not just the pulpit, but other ways that you've encouraged people to think, to read, to engage. Just talk a little bit about the beyond the pulpit context in which this threefold ministry can be carried out.
Yeah. Well, and I will speak to that. I do want to say, I mean, it probably would be worth either talking here or another time or with someone else about I do think that many pastors are in crisis right now. And I think that a recent Burnout statistic showed that more than 33% of pastors would take another job if they could. So many are burned out. It's just a very hard time to be a pastor, and because of all those complicated pressures that you've named. So I do think that there are all sorts of different resources that are available to pastors that I've drawn from myself, including therapy. But yeah, one thing, getting to your question, I think one thing that that has brought consolation to me is that I do think that the pulpit is a really important tool. I mean, it is one of the main things that we're called to be, is people who are inhabiting the pulpit for the specific purpose of proclaiming the gospel through the faithful exposition of Scripture. I'm a bit of a traditionalist in that way. I do think that we're called, that doesn't mean that we just stay in the text, as we've talked about in this conversation. We're called to apply the text, to embody the text, to show how the text is forming and reading us and sending us and equipping us, empowering us to the real things that we're dealing with in the world. However, the pulpit is not our only tool. I write a weekly pastoral letter that goes out on Thursdays to the congregation that sometimes will talk about something that I said in the sermon. Sometimes we'll address, recently when we invaded Iran, I knew that was on everybody's mind. And so I addressed it in the pastoral letter and gave some ways that we might think about it and ways that we might pray. So things, I think we have an opportunity sometimes as pastors to address things that we might not be able to talk in detail about in the pulpit. I think most churches offer teaching classes or teaching forums or classes as an opportunity to be able to go in detail. So just before the 2024 election, for example, we had an 8-week class on being faithful as a Christian in the midst of a contentious political election. And I was able to teach to be one of the main teachers for that, and it enabled me to go into great detail about even my own theology of political engagement in ways that I couldn't do in the pulpit. And then I think, written reflections, sometimes I'll write articles or blog posts or write a post that maybe specifically addresses what is Christian nationalism and how do we understand what that means. And we hear this word thrown around all the time, but what does it actually mean? I think an issue like that you wouldn't probably preach a whole sermon about that, but it would be a good thing to address. So I think that pastors, especially in these days with how capacious the opportunities are around different media, it's a really good way for us to think creatively about how we can formation can be a holistic and comprehensive experience and not just be concentrated in the pulpit.
Right. I think it also provides lots of avenues then for more oxygen than sometimes the pulpit itself provides, so that people can have an opportunity to engage, debate, question, etc., in a way that the unidirectional character or experience for many people of preaching, which is not, I think, typically the preacher's experience, but from the congregation's experience of preaching, it can often feel very unidirectional. But where teaching a class, writing an article, etc., creates an opportunity for something that is really much, much bigger and more complex. I mean, I remember often thinking the more complicated and charged a given topic may be, the more I was likely to want to either do it first in a class or to say whatever I thought I needed to say that was appropriate to the pulpit, which I think for me meant being more boundaried by an exposition of the text that we were looking at. But for the wider conversation to say, now, I know that there are complexities about what I've just been preaching about, and so therefore I'm happy to meet right after this service for an open discussion of whatever it was.
That's great.
Or that we're going to have a class, or that I've written more about this for your reflection, etc. Because I do think part of what causes congregations to blow up is that there isn't enough oxygen flowing, and everyone feels no one wants to be cornered. Everyone can end up feeling like they're being cornered, and then they can't engage, right? Because you've sort of forced them to shut down, and that's never going to work.
And I think the pulpit can be used abusively in that way. I mean, it can be used to in a really partisan way where people feel like they're being beholden to a particular narrow application of the scriptures. I think immigration is a great example of what you're talking about, where we happen to be, when all these things were starting to really get a lot of media attention in the fall, we happened to be preaching through the book of Deuteronomy. And so it just so happened that Deuteronomy speaks a lot about the immigrant, the alien, and the stranger. And so that enabled me to do is I was able to say some very clear things from the pulpit about the Christian call to the immigrant, the nature of human dignity, of the stranger, the call to care for the vulnerable. But of course, how those things are carried out in modern policy and policy issues as it relates to immigration is far more complicated. And Christians who are on different sides of the political aisle can actually come to different conclusions based on the same ethic. And so we also were able to have a class where we were able to actually talk about immigration and actually talk about it on a policy level. But that, that's just not something that I should be doing in the pulpit. I shouldn't be talking about immigration policy in the pulpit, but I should be calling people, radically to care for the immigrant, no matter whether they're undocumented or documented or whatever they may be. They are still someone made in the image of God and deserve the utmost dignity, and we treat them as human beings to be loved. So I think that using those different mediums is vital.
I want to go back, Corey, to the moment where you said we might discuss this later about the incredible despair that many pastors are experiencing. You're absolutely right that the number of pastors that are in crisis is far greater than I think most people really understand. And so much of it has to do with the texture of the things that we're describing. And in some cases, it's because in their congregation, it has already been a five-alarm fire. And in some cases, they're wanting to stem it from becoming a five-alarm fire. They often feel isolated, alone, unseen, misunderstood, but they also have a strong sense of call to try to bring their congregation through the contention to some clearer place, which doesn't necessarily mean everybody's in agreement, but to a stronger place of communion on the other end, not just a place of declaration and division. As you read things like the Barna study that you referred to and so forth, what stands out to you that you might have expected or that you might be surprised by about the cause of these concerns?
Yeah. Nothing surprised me because I've experienced all of these things myself. I think one of the things that was so sad to me about that study that I read recently was about friendship, that so few pastors can name like a single person that they would be able to name as an authentic friend. And I think that's really true. I personally am blessed to have rich friends that knew me, that live here in Richmond, that knew me before I was a pastor. And so to them, I'm not Pastor Corey, I'm just Corey, and I'm super grateful for that. But I think many pastors find themselves in situations where they're leading a community, they're in their imaginations, they believe that this should be an embodiment of the kingdom of God, a proleptic foretaste of the banquet that is coming, where we are deeply united around Jesus and loving one another the way they do in the book of Acts. But in reality, you're like, people are mad at you because the choir is, not singing enough, or this session member has a power struggle with you. And in reality, like, you feel like, I can't be my authentic self with these people. I can't actually tell them what's going on in my marriage. I can't tell them because they'll think I'm a fraud. I can't tell them what's going on with my teenage kid. And so I think that so many pastors end up feeling disintegrated, split. There's a splitness. There's a lack of authenticity, a lack of transparency. And when you can't, and when you feel like you're trying to build this authentic community, but you yourself feel so inauthentic, can be a very, I think, disintegrating experience. And I certainly have experienced that at times. And I think it's really propelled me to see the importance of having at least a few people in the church that I can be truly authentic with, or who know everything that's going on in my life. And then lots of people outside the church that I can share authentically with too. So that's the big thing, I think, isolation and loneliness and fragmentation.
When you add what you've just said to the moment that we're in which there's just in general a problem with relationships and with trust and with an inability to cross boundaries, it seems, or to want to cross boundaries, be willing to risk crossing boundaries, does leave pastors, I think, easily that much more isolated. And I think that is one of the main words that describes it. And that is just never good. It's never how we're meant to be. We're far less likely to be able to make our way through the chapter of that season of life if we don't have people with us that we know are with us. And yeah, I certainly can say that I spend a fair amount of time talking with pastors that are in such circumstances, and the burdens, the fears, the sense that their hands are tied, and also my sense that sometimes they have tied their own hands. It's really both and.
Yeah. And feeling like, the people that, that I'm depending on for my livelihood are also the people that I need to be shepherding, and are also the people that I need to speak prophetically to. And yet if I do, then, what is going to happen to our budget this year? I mean, there's just so many complex issues at play. I know years ago I read a wonderful essay by the Irish poet David White, in which he talks about burnout. And I think many pastors are very burned out. And he says the opposite of burnout, or the remedy for burnout, is not rest, but wholeness, wholeheartedness. And I think that truly speaks to, like, when I was burned out, in 2021, 2022, which nearly really brought me to the end of myself and my career, I can see that that's what was going on, is that, I was probably getting enough sleep, but I just felt so pulled apart. I felt so disintegrated. I felt, who can I be myself? How can I be myself in this role? And I think that wholeness is so evasive, and it's so difficult, evasive. I think, for some pastors to apprehend.
Yeah. One of the things that shapes it, I think, too, is the expectations of congregations. I mean, we live in a grab and go culture, right? Everywhere you turn, it seems like you see a sign with something like that on. Mm-hmm. Just, you don't have to be here for more than a nanosecond to get whatever you are coming for and to get off or out or away or to the next thing or whatever it may be. And I compare that sometimes in my mind to the images of Psalm 1 about the sense of being rooted and dwelling
for a really
in a
long
space
time,
where all of the nutrients are pouring into your body, right? And I'm not trying to scandalize in either direction or to harshly critique, but just to acknowledge that those two things are about as different as two things could be. And the instincts of that integratedness that you're describing has to come from time. And yet one of the other parts of pastoral ministry that we haven't talked about is often pastors' experience that there is no time. And yet the gift of being called as a pastor is a gift of time. It's like you don't have to do another job. We're giving you all of your time, which we will pay for you to now be free to be our pastor. But it becomes a slavish vocation of demand rather than actually a gift of time that allows the pastor to do the kind of meditative and reflective work that's necessary. Somehow you seem to have made room for that, which I want to honor, because I do think that's a huge part of.
Well, I mean, a lot of it has come through great suffering and having to grapple with my own demons and my own false self, and recognizing the ways that I've often used this vocation as a way to achieve the things that my distorted soul craves, whether it be attention or approval or privilege or whatever it might be. And I think really embracing the contemplative tradition over the last 5 years and really seeing communion with God as the heart of the Christian life, rather than activism or, proclaiming or having the right answers or whatever it might be. But I think seeing communion and life, our deep, deep life with God, for me, centering prayer has been an essential practice. Silence and learning to be present and to hear and be present in that voice of love. So, but it just took a lot of bumps and bruises to get to the point where I realized that was what was missing in my life was that rootedness that you're talking about, that rootedness in the communion that is always there, but I often am not tuned into it.
Right. Corey, you've given us so much to be nourished by today in this conversation, and I do pray for you, as you know, and I will continue to do so. And as we finish, I just want to acknowledge, particularly to pastors who may be listening to this, how much empathy I think both Corey and I have for the vocation that we share together, and we have to carry it out in wildly different local settings. But we share a lot of the burden and the dynamics that we've tried to at least briefly talk about today. And that certainly as I finish this call, I'm praying for any pastors who eventually hear this, for people in congregations who have pastors who might be able to encourage your pastor in this time rather than to necessarily make more demands on them. And also that in this Lent together as a community, that we can continue to walk more deeply into this Lenten season in all of its Lentaniness, as you said, and to arrive at Easter not as a one-shot moment, a grab and go on Easter for hope, but a living into what the liturgical calendar calls Eastertide. So may it be so for you, Corey, and for your family, and
thank you, Mark, and for you, and for all who are listening, both pastors and others. So,
yeah,
thanks for the privilege of this conversation.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.